heavy lift on those folks in the system that can do that kind of thing. They're trying to adapt, trying to work with companies that have technologies that can respond to the health crisis, but they have so many layers of red tape, and the bureaucracy is so heavy that it's really, really challenging for them. So what we're finding is if we provide guidance on how to engage, if our companies approach these government officials with a plan that they can get them to buy into, it makes it much easier. So I think at the end of the day, what we're seeing is we can't just ask government to help and expect that they will. We have to go to the government and say, here's what we could do if you would do X, Y, and Z. And we know you can do X and Y because of this situation. We just need you to figure out how to do Z. So they're willing, they're mostly able to help, but they really need our help to mobilize their resources. And I think the thing to realize too is, and it saddens me to say this having been in government, but a lot of the things that they're doing are for optics. They want it to look like they're doing something, even though, so they're releasing program information and they may not be fully ready on the back end to implement those programs. So from our side, from the side, people outside the fence, we need to be patient, but still persistent. We need to be polite about our communication, but still be a little bit aggressive in how we engage and really help them to understand how they can help us and the value that we bring to these projects and to these challenges.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Stephen?
You know, my view is that the role of government in entrepreneurship is you know, big things done slowly. And the role of entrepreneurs is smaller things done quickly. So these days I'm spending most of my time with startups who have had, in my experience, an explosion of energy around a whole variety of needs that they can quickly fill. And I'll just cite a few examples like this. There's one company that is a startup that I have worked with in East Africa who are basically coming up with what I call it an Etsy for seafood. It's a marketplace to get fresh seafood directly to consumers who can order online. The distribution supply chain has all but collapsed. People are afraid to go to the large markets. And so now there are these very quick marketplaces that are arising for a variety of things. In this one example that I mentioned, it's seafood. Another group that I've been talking to a little bit are experts in 3D printing and have been 3D printing a number of things, including masks. This particular group focuses on low-cost health and medical equipment that's used particularly in pediatrics. So they have been producing everything from disposable milk bottles to very simple kinds of wraps for newborns that are thermal. There's another group I know that has developed a very good natural fiber-based textile that they are now producing masks with, which they were originally producing other items of apparel. Great company, young company that's gotten much more involved in water. They were already in the water purification business. They've now, and this is a big issue, particularly in poor areas, favelas, refugee camps, to develop quick methods of producing and particularly then providing drinking water. And this is all existing technology that's been adapted. So, and the places where I've seen sort of the ecosystem supporting the entrepreneurs, which I think is a big part of what Michael wanted us to be talking about today. You know, as I said before, the weak ecosystems are, the failings are highlighted at a time like this. And the stronger ecosystems, the same is true. So for instance, Rwanda, which I believe has probably one of the strongest ecosystems in sub-Saharan Africa, has had a disproportionate amount of entrepreneurial activity during the virus, just as they have had before, because they have a strong ecosystem. Similarly, smaller organizations within an ecosystem, particularly universities. So as I mentioned, I'm affiliated with MIT, which has an extraordinary amount going on in terms of, for example, crowdsourcing platforms that are run by the university and focused on different areas, everything from the biological and pharma aspect of this to physical goods that are required, specifically masks and gowns. So there are a lot of things that you can do inventively and creatively where ecosystem players can provide the track that entrepreneurs can then build and run the trains over. And those are just a few examples that I cited.
Thanks, Stephen. Usal, what are you seeing in Turkey?
Sure. So I think this is a very interesting time for the startups to work with governments. And we see everything that we know in theory in an accelerated pace, meaning this is a very good time to catalyze some of the change in regulations that you would want for a long time, but that no one listens to you if it really overlaps with the, with the requirements to overcome the crisis. If you need something in fintech that has been long time avoided by the banks, that would, enable digital payments, this is a very good time, right? If you need anything in digital platforms that would, strengthen the capacity of these platforms, this is a very good time. But this is also a very good time for the larger startup companies to engage with their communities. Because most of the, the engineering-driven startup motto is to serve the user. But when you're serving the user, if you are also, working with some gig economy workers, working with some delivery guys, working with some cleaners, working with some drivers, like Uber is doing, etc., then these companies generally neglect the communities of the suppliers that they have. Now, those suppliers are in crisis, and it's a very good time for the, the startups to go back to their suppliers and reconnect and make peace with them, if they can use this opportunity. So it's both on the government side and on the community side, it's an opportunity for the startups. Of course, I'm talking more about the well-funded startups at the moment. If you are not really well-funded and if you have to close a round in the next quarter or so, you are in big trouble, obviously, because the funding is likely to dry up. No one is likely to take risk. And you will need some bridge funding, possibly from the government agencies. But unfortunately, the startups are not likely to be the first priority of any government in the world in this crisis. They are more likely to give money, A, to the ones who lose their jobs, B, to the big companies who already have larger lobbying power. So we see this in the United States, but we see this in emerging markets as well. Now, for the emerging markets, the context is a bit different because most of the emerging market countries are fiscally constrained, which means the stimulus that they can generate will be lower than that in the advanced economies like Europe or in the US. So it's harder time also for the startups, but if you are well-funded and lucky at this time, it's also a very good opportunity.
Great. Thanks, Usal. I'm going to open it up to the community for questions. I did get a note from Jovan Stalveski from Macedonia, who's a friend from the run of the MOOC. So I unmuted. So Jovan, if you can introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Hello, Michael. Hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you for reopening the MOOC Beyond Silicon Valley. It was really well welcomed here in Macedonia as well. What to say? For me, as a, let's say, a representative and of a business sector, and also a leader organization that deals with needs and support of entrepreneurs here in Macedonia. We also work closely with government, but also with other institutions who help entrepreneurs. So these times are really maybe like Lisa said, it's like bureaucratic times that needs time in order to make some measures, in order to calculate all the situation, in order to get some package to recover the economy. So what we discovered that all around the world, all the governments make some kind of, let's say, help for recovering the economy. And maybe our government, Macedonian government, made something similar like in the EU, what government's done. So basically, they launched packages with help, like financial help, maybe a donation or maybe like a loans to the economy, to all the sectors basically in the economy. And but it's, let's say, different in order of the weight. Like for example, if in Slovenia they give 700 euros per month for a person to cover their costs, like a salary, let's minimum wage. In Macedonia they give 200 or 250. Also, our banks are let's say free the loans and the rates for 6 months for the companies and for the physical for the people. And what is everything happening? It's according to me, it's really good, and every business in Macedonia, they're sort of satisfied, let's say. But my question, which is concerned now as an entrepreneur also, how will be the role of the governments of the states after this crisis? Why I'm asking? Because from previous experience until now, not a lot of people are welcoming government when they are interfering into the economical things or in the business or something. But now, when this crisis happened, everyone in one voice, like collectively, we address to the government, help us, because we don't know what to do. Do you understand? So I think that the governments and the states will come in a big door after this. So I want to hear the opinion of maybe of Ms. Lisa, Mr. Koltai, and other panelists. Yeah.
Lisa, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think what's going to happen with some of the government programs, the ones that they find are successful, government likes success, they like things easy. So if they find that adjusting their attitudes and behaviors with regard to support for the entrepreneurial community yields positive results, that may encourage them to continue to do these kinds of things. You know, they like to take the simple route, and so my hope is that we'll come through this with more appreciation on both sides for the role that we can play in building out our economy. That government can understand that they can be a catalyst for change, but to Stephen's point, you know, government does big things slowly. They are in a position to help those who do small things quickly more than they know. So if we can show them that that the stimulus, that opening up lines of communication, that easing some of the bureaucracy to move healthcare products forward, to get certifications, that really works, then perhaps they will entertain continuing with that as we go forward. If it doesn't work, they'll probably just go back to business as usual. But wherever we see a success in that, I think we need to feed that back to them and say, hey, it's really great that you're doing this. Here's what we see as a change, and here's how it's impacted what we're doing. Please keep doing that, and communicate with them about those successes and those wins.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Stephen, did you want to add anything?
Well, I would just say one of the most interesting things that I think we're seeing is the rise of local government as the national government is eclipsed. Obviously, this is true in the United States, but it's true all over. Brazil, for instance, is very similar to what's going on in the US, where things are happening at the state and particularly the local level much more than at the federal level. And so I think that it is very interesting to look at what, I always believe that entrepreneurship ecosystems are hyper local anyway. And that, what exists in Istanbul is totally irrelevant if you are in Anatolia somewhere, and it's, impossible to get to. And it's true almost everywhere, anywhere where you have a reasonably large country. Entrepreneurship ecosystems are really hyper local. So and hyper local, the local government, the city government, the county government, whatever the particular political jurisdiction is, that's where I think we need to be looking for a lot more of the innovation. I think the federal government or the national governments will be the last to move, not the first to move.
Saul, anything to add?
I agree. And I think we'll also see a lot of, not only localism on the, local governments or municipality side, but also, a new kind of nationalism where, the borders will be higher, the trade barriers will be higher, including those in digital. This could be also an opportunity for some entrepreneurs who want to start businesses in their countries. If there are data localization requirements, etc., they can utilize them. And, if the market is reasonably large, they can build scalable businesses using those, barriers to entry.
Great. Thanks, Saul. I'm going to unmute Noelle, who's joining us, if you can see from her background, from Paris. And Noelle is someone we got to know during the first run of the course, and we've got to meet in person when I was in France. So Noelle, it's great to see you.
It's good to see you, and thanks for reigniting the class again. I think it's a very timely moment to do that. In France, can you hear me?
You can, yeah.
Okay, sorry, because I'm not in the. There I go. I'm in green now. So, in France, in terms of the French, and if people are familiar with the French tech. Government initiative to help support tech entrepreneurs in France, or the whole tech ecosystem. And they've really actually stepped in quite a bit with a $4 billion bailout for the tech entrepreneurs in France. I think that the tech has always been one of the industries that France has really tried to develop. They have a huge R&D. Generally, they're very big in R&D, but a lot of the businesses, once they get started, they go to the US. So they've been very conscientious of trying to support a local ecosystem, tech ecosystem, as much as possible. And so when the coronavirus hit and they sent everyone home, they turned around fairly quickly to come up with this $4 billion aid, basically, to help keep the startup ecosystem going. So, some of the other initiatives that you see, and since France is very, they have the health, the government health coverage, a lot of the large transportation infrastructure companies at one time were government owned, so they can actually very, very quickly kind of go back into, for example, the SNCF, the train system, and put in place all kinds of mobility units to move patients around the country, so hospitals don't get filled up on one part of the country. And a lot of this is, I'd say, a lot of the infrastructure that France has been built on has been built also on a lot of small, not small, but a lot of the startups and a lot of this whole tech infrastructure that they've tried to put in place over the last few years. So, we'll see how France comes out of this, how the tech ecosystem comes out of this, but they are really putting a lot of effort behind supporting the industry. A second thing that they're doing is and there was an article in the New York Times about kind of the differences in the French, how they're supporting layoffs and businesses that might have to lay off companies versus the United States. Most of the companies here are going into partial or furlough, I guess, mode, kind of. And with employees' salaries being also supported by the government. And I think they're kind of what they're betting on is that once we come out of the coronavirus, that the companies, instead of having to lay people off and then retraining a whole new, population for companies, they would rather just have the companies put a few employees on furlough for the time being, so that they can jumpstart the economy as quick as possible. So that's having an impact not just on the tech entrepreneurs, but it's also impacting some of the larger companies too. So we'll see how the French government, I think a lot of governments in Europe are kind of betting that a partial layoff will, in the long run, help companies, help the whole ecosystem get started again when we come out of this. So.
Well, thanks, Noel, for sharing what's going on. Any reflections from our panel about some of the things that Noel's sharing from France? Yeah, go ahead, Yussel.
So I think the critical element in what France is doing is that if a policymaker understands how a startup works, then it is much easier to respond this well. Now, most of the policymakers think that startups are just like normal companies where they have inputs, they finance the inputs, they sell the output, and they make money at the margin. That's not the case. The startups mostly develop new products. For that, they are getting venture funding, angel financing, and they are building the product and they are then taking it to the market. Now, in this kind of a company, you are always cash flow negative, right? So if a government extends as a response to the crisis a loan guarantee program, since the company is cash flow negative, no bank will give them a loan. So it doesn't make any sense, right? You need to have a tailored program for the startups for the ecosystem to survive, because if these ecosystems collapse, if this thing lasts until the end of the year, and if these ecosystems collapse, you basically lose the organizational capital that exists in different startups. And you need to have those startups next to each other so that people think that there is a startup ecosystem. I can work in this ecosystem. I can work and then start a business, etc. You shouldn't allow an ecosystem to collapse. And for that, you need to provide cash to these companies, which is, as far as we learned, what French government is doing. But the critical element here is policymakers who understands how a startup works.
Thanks, Yussel. Lisa or Stephen, anything to add in? Okay. Sonia Pryor-Jones, love to have you join the conversation. Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you also. Thanks for having me. I didn't get a chance to introduce myself earlier, but I'm Sonia Pryor-Jones. I serve as the Chief Implementation Officer for the FAB, F-A-B Foundation. We grew out of the Center for Bits and Atoms at MIT, and we steward an international network of Fab Labs, which are a brand of maker spaces developed by Dr. Neil Gershenfeld over at CBA. And I was curious to know from the panelists' perspective, with a lot more advanced technologies like 3D printing and design software being far more accessible to everyday people, including entrepreneurs, what kind of partnerships do you see arising from that between entrepreneurs and government?
I will take that because I'm actually seeing some things with some of the companies in my portfolio. So we see a lot of entrepreneurs stepping forward, saying that they can make masks, they can make filters for masks, they can make new kinds of protective equipment, and they can do that by modifying some existing technology. And the first response from government is, yeah, we want everybody to participate. We want everybody to jump in and help out with this. And then the entrepreneur gets stymied because if the business is very small, they may not have the capital to put forward to actually start a new process. We have one in particular that has their core business is nanofibers for wound care, but those nanofibers can be used for vastly improved surgical masks and respirators. That's not their core business, but they believe they can support the nation in this crisis and want to do so. So they've gone to government agencies to hold their hand up and say, hey, we can help do this. Can you give us the seed money for this project? And the government folks are reverting back to the way that they always operate, and saying, okay, well, how much capital are you going to raise? Who's your VC? What's your market? What's your business strategy? What's your plan? What research have you done? And the companies are kind of, looking at them going, wait, we're not switching our business model. We want to help in a crisis. We're going to make extra bread and we're going to provide that, but we're really not bakers. And so there's a lot of struggle with that. The willingness of entrepreneurs to engage in their community, to support their community, to be collaborative, and government still not quite knowing how to do that. And so I see Deb Hoover on here, and I think the philanthropic community, as it's done so well in Ohio, may be able to step in and say, okay, we'll help seed this change for the duration of this issue, so that the business can stay in business, so that the community benefits, and so that government can kind of figure out how this goes. But it's really difficult because they just, companies they're ready to roll. This company was ready to start producing masks within about 5 days, and they couldn't get over the hump of how do we fund that first batch of masks, and then we'll start selling them. So it's a huge shift in thinking is required for government to act quickly on this. But I think there are pockets where people are. It's just not always the people who actually can make decisions about signing checks and writing contracts.
Thanks, Lisa. Stephen Rusal, anything you want to add, or should we get to the next question? Okay. Lovemore from Zimbabwe, welcome. We exchanged a message in the chat and you had a question. If you can introduce yourself and ask your question to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Lovemore Karewe. Can you hear me?
Yeah, maybe speak a little louder if you can.
Okay. I'm from Zimbabwe, right? Thank you guys for introducing this. It's new for me, so I'm a bit shaky, but I have a question that I wanted to ask. It has got to do, you were explaining more on how government can be able to help us, right, in these challenges that we have. But here in Southern Africa, I like what Stephen said. He has worked with countries in sub-Saharan Africa, right? We are currently facing a challenge where most of our governments have got a huge debt. And this huge debt for us to start up businesses is a challenge. So we have to resolve to situations where we need to help the government rather than the government helping us. So in that scenario, how best can we have these startups? Because when you go to a government and you want to have a startup, they'll tell you don't have money because they've got huge debts. It's different from countries like America, where the government can just chip in with $2 trillion and everything is fine. We have got companies that have got big debts here. So how best can you help us to probably have those businesses to say, I want to have a startup, but I would need capital. How best can we start up as young people so that because this pandemic is affecting all of us, and most of us in third world countries, we live like, how can I put it, hand to mouth. So that is a challenge now. When you are saying the country is locked down, we want to start up a business, how best can we do it? Probably, I think Lisa can help me. It's got a lot to do with economics as well. Thank you. That was my question.
Great. Thanks, Lovemore. It's so great to have folks from all over the world joining. And maybe Stephen, do you want to start? I know you've done a lot of work with different hats, supporting entrepreneurs around the world, particularly in the developing world.
Yeah, well, the first thing I always say to people is you have to correct your perception of what happens in rich countries like this one. I can assure you that none of the $2 trillion will go to entrepreneurs in the United States. And any of the $2 trillion that goes to anybody that is not a Fortune 500 company will not probably get there for a very long time. And when it does, it will be a very small amount. So don't feel like you are in particularly unusually hard or bad shape, because you'd be in just as bad shape if you were in Ohio or Maine or any place else. The conversation needs to start not with how do you raise money. The conversation needs to start with what is the product or service that you are trying to provide, and what is the pain point or the need that you are trying to solve. And that's the beginning of any entrepreneurial conversation. So, for example, if the pain point is clean drinking water, which it is in a lot of places that I have worked, then you have to do an entrepreneur's analysis of what are the problems in this particular community that I'm trying to serve. Is it that there is no clean drinking water, or is it that there's no way to get the clean drinking water to the people? We could find the water, we just can't distribute it. In which case you're talking about starting a distribution company, in which case there are a whole bunch of other people that you would talk to, and in my list of sort of the top 5, none of them are government entities. So they would, I would start, for example, with companies that have, or organizations that have an interest either on the for-profit or the not-for-profit side in that space. And in the case of water in Africa, there are, if you did a 2-minute Google search, you would come up with 20 different names of organizations that you could be talking to. And in your particular geography, what you need to look at is, who is interested in this particular in this particular issue for this particular geography. So I would start with the solution that you are trying to offer, and then figure out who are the people who have a vested interest in supporting that solution, either financially or as partners. Because there may be people who manufacture water purification equipment, for example, but don't have a customer to sell to in that particular geography. Or there may be people who are expert at the delivery of the water, not the production of the clean water, but again, they're looking for a counterpart in the local geography. So those, I would approach the problem not from where are the financing sources, but what is my solution and who cares most about my solution.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Lisa or Saul, any additional comment? You guys are good. Okay, Deb Hoover, maybe I'll put you on the spot to join us. I saw you posted a question in the chat, but maybe it's a nice chance as we link this week's panel to next week's panel, if you can introduce yourself and pose the question to the group, if you don't mind.
Great, thank you, Michael. And thanks for putting this together and bringing Beyond Silicon Valley back and in this age of the pandemic. Very much appreciate it. So I think a lot these days about the role of philanthropy. And I think it dovetails to, what Lisa has been saying about, government. Yes, we get the dollars flowing, but it's a little bit slow to get them out there. So as I'm wrestling with how to deploy our dollars in the best way possible, I'm just thinking now, you know, how do we get those dollars into the system where they're needed now before those dollars are flowing from the government? So I would just love to hear, you know, from the panelists and others. I will say that our foundation, Burton D. Morgan Foundation, you know, we've been looking at ways to fill gaps that we see. So, you know, we've given a grant so far for no interest loans. We did give a couple of grants to some maker spaces in our Northeast Ohio region to be able to, you know, utilize their existing equipment to produce PPE. So we have not done that with businesses to date, but we have done it in the nonprofit space. So I'd love to hear some ideas and thoughts on that conundrum.
Great, thanks, Deb. Go, Stephen. Yeah.
Well, what I love that you have this problem. It's a wonderful problem. I would say, off the top of my head, one of the things that I would look at if I were in your shoes is, as I was saying before, it's actually small government that's most local, and also public institutions that are the places where I think you could put these dollars to work fastest, and you could probably even leverage them with some public money. So you could do public-private funding programs. And I'm thinking of, you know, things like municipal governments, so town and city governments. I'm thinking of regional hospitals, medical centers, who have very clear and specific sort of shopping lists, which, by the way, also include not just physical goods, but they also include intangibles like retraining workers who have been laid off in other industries and are now needed very quickly to shift from one thing to another. I mean, who is going to staff these huge convention centers that are now filled with hospital beds? Who is going to prepare the meals for all of the people who are now doing this work? It's, you know, so there are unemployed restaurant workers in a particular community that now need very quick retraining, and they're not, I'm not talking about, you know, weeks and months, I'm talking about days, where a little bit of money could go a very long way to helping shift workers to triage, really, to immediate needs. So that's one of the first things that jumps to mind for me about ways I would creatively think about deploying, you know, some capital.
Those are great ideas, Stephen. Thank you very much.
And I'm happy to follow up at any time, by the way. Michael knows how to get a hold of me.
Great, I appreciate that.
Great.
So I would add to that, I think one of the things that government is challenged with is they have to take everybody. They have to look at all of the ideas across the board, because they are, you know, they are paid by the citizens of a state, of a city, of a nation. And as intermediaries and as forces outside, we can help screen through some of that, help eliminate some of the noise. So Deb, to your point, if you become aware of a company or an organization that could partner with government, and as Stephen says, in some kind of public-private partnership, and you can help to vet those opportunities so that the best of the best rises to the top, and you are their champion or their advocate, that holds a lot of sway with those local governments and with those state governments. So I know in Ohio, the respect that the foundation has within federal government or within state government is significant, well beyond just the Northeast Ohio area. So you coming in and saying, hey, we have this company that's approached us and they can do these things, but they need some assistance from government to do that. We can help up to a point. Could you match what we're doing, or could we leverage our resources against yours in some way? And I think that can be very, very helpful as being that go-between, from, as we say, from inside the fence and outside the fence, which is how we work. We stand on the fence between DoD and the rest of the world and bring people together. And I think you're uniquely positioned to do that as well, and use a small amount of your resources to help those entrepreneurs access a greater amount of resources from government.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We are actually being called upon by some local governments to provide some counsel as to what they do with the dollars that they, to come along in the coming weeks to be able to give them the best possible tools to the ecosystem.
Yeah, and like Stephen, I'm happy to follow up afterwards and talk about what we're doing, what you're doing, and do anything we can to help.
Great, thank you very much, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks, Deb, for the great question. We probably have time for one more question, and I'm just sort of looking at the chat, and because you just put it up, I mean, Katlego, I might be pronouncing your name incorrectly, from South Africa. Do you want to, I'm seeing it just pop up, do you want to kind of ask the last question or make the last comment?
Basically, it's more of a comment.
Okay. And introduce yourself too, please.
Katlego Mtibakgomo, Managing Director of a company called Spani Foundation.
Okay.
So basically, we deal with situations at a social level. And then with us here in South Africa, I think it's more of a comment than anything. And if it's a question of what government can do, I believe, in my own personal opinion, that the South African government and South African businessmen and some of the companies that we have this side, they really came to the party in trying to tackle this pandemic and trying to assist a lot of the people that are affected by the pandemic. What the government did is that when they announced the shutdown, they set up a fund that people could basically donate into, that corporate could donate into, so that it could help relieve some of the areas that they basically can't reach. They also created, with some of the businessmen donated about, we had 2 businessmen who donated $1 billion each. So that specifically was targeted towards the small businesses. And then later on, another one came up with a fund, and then they basically sectionalized the money in a way that specific budgets were targeted for specific industries or specific sectors. And then they called on business people, they called on our revenue service, they called on our labor departments. So if you are an employee, and then for you as an individual to get relief, you would have to go to maybe the Department of Labor, apply so that you can get your salary from them, so that the people that employ you wouldn't have to stress at that time. So that in essence gave companies the opportunity to, because we've been getting SMSs from some of the companies that we owe. Some of the, there's a company that we have here, Markham. They were telling us they come to us and tell us that for the next coming 2 months, you don't have to pay your installment. The banks, I got a message from a bank telling me that for the next coming 3 months, they have reprieve to basically give us that space to say, okay, fine, we don't have to pay any interest, or we don't have to pay back our loan for the coming month or so. So basically, that's what's happening in South Africa now.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Just to wrap up, I see we got about 2 minutes left. Any sort of final thought or comment, Usama? We'll kind of start with you and go back down the panel. Either a comment on what Katlego met or just your own.
Let me just make a brief comment on South Africa. I think this is a response that we see in other emerging markets as well. Also in Turkey, since there is no fiscal space, the governments call on the private sector to donate, and with that money they will help the ones who lose. Now the problem is, if this lasts more than 3 months, this is not sustainable. You can't, finance this through donations. B, the private sector itself, probably apart from a few very large and well-capitalized corporates, are in extremely bad shape because they lost their cash flow, right? So this is not a good approach. This is not a sustainable approach. It is only temporary. What the emerging markets needs to do is to go to IMF or the World Bank and ask for money. There is no other way, because you can't finance this through the private debt markets. You need to go to the international community. You need to accept the conditionality, and you need to finance through international loans. Now, this of course has a political cost, but this is also the cost of being unprepared to this kind of a crisis. With this, I would like to thank you very much, and all the panelists, all the participants. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks, Usal. Stephen?
Well, I come from a point of view that particularly in developing countries, although those of us in so-called developed countries are rapidly approaching the same place, government is generally viewed as not only incompetent, but corrupt. And as a result, a lot of people, including investors, are very reluctant to go through a government intermediary to try to, for example, spur entrepreneurship, which is what we're all interested in, because there's a huge cut that the government is going to take, and what ends up getting to the designated program is often very, very small. That's not to say that there aren't other entities, and I think particularly of very high quality NGOs and not-for-profit, some of whom have very sophisticated methods of both managing and diligencing and accounting for funds. So I think that whether it's money that comes from inside the country, and of course the one thing that all very poor countries have is a few unbelievably rich people. So it's always important to start looking at home at people who are interested, and South Africa is a perfect example, but it's true of every country. And look at whether or not there are other intermediaries that can play the role, at least initially, that in ideal times you might expect government to be able to play. So that's really my main advice, is to not look to government as the first source of the solution, but to look at other intermediaries as in the short term.
Lisa, final comment on this, or just something to wrap up?
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up on what Stephen said a little bit. And, even though we're talking about the role of government in this, I think we have to learn to be a little more self-sufficient. I think the entrepreneurial community that we're a part of can be very encouraging and very helpful, perhaps in ways that we wouldn't necessarily think about. So partnerships with people that share incubator space or that are part of your small business community. It sounds like it's kind of Pollyannish, but the way I look at it is none of us have enough resources to do everything, but collectively we can pool our resources and do anything. Government does not work well. They don't play well with others, but entrepreneurs do. We know how to get things done. And I think we can help each other. It's not always a matter of money. We had a lot of money in the third frontier, but it really wasn't money at the end of the day that fixed our problems and put us on a path. It was learning to collaborate effectively. And, I've seen so many resources going through the chat, and Suzanne, I hope you're going to capture this so we can get that information out. But when we find a resource that helps us, we should make sure that the rest of our community knows about that resource and just learn to lean on each other. If we're bringing stuff back into our home nations for manufacturing, for sourcing, I think that's good for all of us. Reducing our dependency on people that are so far away, we can't touch them, we can't engage with them, we really don't know what they're doing. So I would just encourage everyone, work together, continue to communicate. Michael, I so appreciate this program from the beginning, because it does help us understand other perspectives and points of view and other ways things are getting done, because we're not always right in the US and we're not always the smartest users of our money. So finding people that are doing things in a way that's lean and mean is good for all of us.
Awesome, Lisa. Well, great way to wrap up. And thank you so much to the panel and for all of you who are joining. I mean, I think one of the unique things about this moment that we're in, I mean, Cleveland and Northeast Ohio and sort of sharing our story and kind of our struggle. There were things that we were going through in the US that we found kind of folks, whether it's Macedonia or South Africa, other parts of the world, we're sort of going through at different points. Now we're in this moment where we're all going through this together. So the crisis is hitting everywhere. It was really interesting to hear perspectives from around the world about what governments are doing. I think a lot of the advice from the panel, which is a great lead in to next week. So we'll, Deb Hoover, who's on, will be anchoring some perspectives on philanthropy with some other folks from the region and national perspectives. And we'll be doing this each week. So thanks for those of you who are in the course. That is another area where in our discussion forums and on peer review, we can sort of share ideas. Because again, this is more about us teaching each other. It's not about me instructing you. It's really a forum to share ideas. And today's kind of kickoff panel discussion was a great way to do it. So stay safe. Best of luck to all of you, and look forward to seeing those of you who can make it. It's going to be the exact same time next week, and I'll send something out, an announcement in our course notes and also via social media. So have a wonderful weekend and great to see everybody. And thanks, panelists. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.